This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, we now bring you a discussion on crisis in Afghanistan. The participants are Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Sanjay Jha, journalist.
After nearly 3 months, the Taliban took over of Afghanistan. Friends of Taliban have started saying that Afghanistan will shortly collapse into chaos unless international community acts rapidly. Mr. Wadhwa, Taliban came suddenly. Now we are seeing that they are really into big problem. Afghan's economy is collapsing. More than half its people may go hungry this winter. India has decided to send help. What do you think? Where is Afghanistan headed to?
So I think the process which unfolded in Afghanistan as the Taliban took over was something which was not anticipated by the international community. And it was thought at that point in time, as we all know in hindsight, that the Taliban would wait till a deadline which was set by the United States to leave and then gradually move in and also bring about a unified government in which there would be factions from different communities and women would be given some representation and at the same time try and build consensus because they were coming back as Taliban 2.0 in order to become much more acceptable to the world. But the problem has been the control of Taliban 2.0 by Pakistan and by ISI in particular. We've seen how the ISI has controlled the elements which are more inimical to United States, India and other countries. And obviously those who are closer to the Pakistani establishment have found place in this Taliban 2.0 government. In fact, some of the moderate leaders have been sidelined. None of the promises that were made by the Taliban representatives in Doha, which is called the Doha faction, have actually materialized. And that, therefore, has brought about a certain amount of disenchantment within the international community. The countries which are directly concerned with this issue now are Pakistan, which is saddled with this huge problem of looming refugee crisis, and China, which has backed its ally Pakistan and kept out countries like India from the negotiating process and the consultative process. And this has led to a situation where the other countries are waiting and adopting a wait-and-watch attitude. UN Security Council resolution, which was passed under the chairmanship of India, clearly stated that the soil of Afghanistan must not be used for carrying out terror attacks against its neighbors. And to a certain extent, the Russians also believe that this should be the case going forward. So none of these countries have actually volunteered to jump into recognition of the Taliban regime. And of course, the assets of Afghanistan under this regime remain frozen, so they cannot be released until the conditions are met. Taliban has given no such promises because its agenda is driven by Pakistani ISI. But as to how Pakistan, without the assistance of China, is going to manage this crisis in Afghanistan is a very, very difficult question now. For the world community, the most important question is how to deal with the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And this will be what will be confronting the international community in the coming weeks and months.
Mr. Wadhwa, you rightly pointed out that the countries like Pakistan are also worried about worsening situation in Afghanistan. Pakistani establishment has tried to control everything in Afghanistan. Foreign minister went there, the ISI chief went there. Now, so far in last 3 months, none of the Taliban leaders has come to Pakistan. There is a talk about Afghan interim foreign minister visiting Pakistan to visit bilateral ties high on agenda. Do you think the Pakistanis are getting the pinch of having organization and Taliban in their backyard? And now they need to reset the agenda like, okay, we need to keep a distance from them, otherwise we will also win the problem.
So yes, I think the Pakistani agenda from the very beginning has been to use Pakistani soil and the elements in Taliban 2.0, which are sympathetic to Pakistan, to create trouble and to foment terrorism from its soil directed against countries like India. There is no doubt about that. But the problem is that the Chinese are also very worried about what happens to their underbelly in Xinjiang. And therefore, their first and foremost demand is that those elements are brought to book by the Taliban 2.0 government. And in the process, we've had a situation where there is a certain amount of dissent and a certain amount of resentment amongst the current Taliban government in terms of reining in those elements because they would not like, others to dictate to them. As time goes by, Pakistan's hold on the elements and making sure that they are used for terrorist purposes will also decline in time. It's not because Pakistan is not the country which controls the purse strings. The money is going to come from other countries. And the other countries have clearly put forward conditionalities, including the Chinese. As Pakistan is not in a position by itself to help the Taliban economically or even in terms of food aid. Pakistan itself is reeling under an economic crisis, a political crisis. And it seems to me that they have taken up too much on their hands. Very difficult for them to ensure that the whole process goes in their favor the way they want it. And at the same time, they are not affected by it. And that is why the Pakistani establishment is very keen to invite the Taliban leadership to Pakistan to ensure this happens, or also to put this down on paper for whatever it is worth in order to ensure that they remain unaffected. And in the bargain, they would offer to talk to the rest of the world community, including UAE, Saudi Arabia, the Chinese, of course, and the Russians, to ensure that some amount of aid flows into Afghanistan. I doubt very much if the bank accounts of Afghanistan will be unfrozen by the United States, given the current circumstances and given the fact there are no such promises which have been fulfilled, which were made in the Doha negotiations.
You talked about U.S. not willing to allow the bank accounts of the Afghan government. Members of G20 group of major economies have recently met in Italy, and they have pledged to avert an economic catastrophe in Afghanistan. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said countries should not be allowed to descend into chaos. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that we need to prioritize rights of the women and girls in Afghanistan, has even pledged £50 million. So in this, what is the role of the international community you see in the coming days for the Afghanistan?
The international community, unfortunately, has very little role unless the Taliban government play ball and unless they come up with a clear statement that they are going to respect and fulfill the demands of the Western countries and the larger international community. I think the Taliban government is banking on the support of China to a large extent, and the Chinese are actually waiting for them to fulfill their promise of reining in the elements which are inimical to them as far as Xinjiang is concerned. So that process is taking much longer than expected because obviously there is resistance within the Taliban itself on how to deal with this demand going forward. Meanwhile, Afghanistan descends into chaos because on top of the fact that salaries are not being paid, you also have a fuel shortage, you also have a food price increase, and in fact, you have shortage of food grain in Afghanistan. Countries like India, which have offered to donate wheat, etc., to Afghanistan, are blocked because of Pakistan's selfish interests. They do not want India to have any role whatsoever in Afghanistan, and that obviously is not possible going forward in the current circumstances. In some form or the other, through the World Bank, through WFP, through the international community, through their NGOs, the Taliban will have to allow and accept this international aid. Slowly and surely, after a while, the Taliban will realize that their dependence on Pakistani ISI in Pakistan is not going to get them much leeway, and the promises that they had of the Chinese investments coming into Afghanistan have proved to be empty words so far. I don't see that happening in the near future either. So therefore, we have a situation where the international community is right that they want to save the people of Afghanistan, and there are ways and means of doing that. So the G20 and the UN both have a roadmap for that, and the Afghans have to allow humanitarian aid to come in through their airport in Kabul to designated agencies, which I believe is not far off because the disaster is looming and the people of Afghanistan are going to turn against the Taliban if they do not take steps in that direction.
As you rightly said, Pakistan doesn't want any role for India in Afghanistan. But despite that, India's National Security Advisor is hosting a meeting of NSAs in the neighborhood, including Russia, on November 10th to discuss Afghanistan's future and how to deal with threats to security coming from the developments there. The exercise is to reform the consensus that after the pullout of US and NATO troops from Afghanistan, solutions to the crisis in Afghanistan must come from the region itself. China and Pakistan, which are two very important players in Afghan, have decided not to attend this conference. Can we hope to get much success from this conference despite these two important players not attending it? Although our National Security Advisor has said that the conference is against radicalization, not against Taliban as such. But do you think there can be some outcome from this conference?
Well, I don't think there was any expectation from the very beginning that the Pakistani NSA would be attending this conference because, as I said earlier, Pakistan does not want India to play any role whatsoever in the process in Afghanistan. And obviously, given the current situation on the border with China and Pakistan-China collaboration on many issues, and that includes Afghanistan, of course, we would expect also the Chinese not to come into this conference. That does not mean that the others are unimportant. Because you have very important players like Iran, like Russia, India. You also have the Central Asian states which border Afghanistan. Without their support, the Taliban government will be in difficulty. And I'm sure that, there would be a positive way which will evolve going forward, coordinated possibility of action on Afghanistan with two main aims. The first aim being that the territory of Afghanistan is not used for terrorist purposes. And that's also concern of Russia. It's also concern of the bordering CIS states of Iran and, of course, India. The second aim is, of course, to make sure that the Taliban government is impressed upon acceptance of aid through the established bodies which the UN has been working with, like the World Bank and WFP in Afghanistan, and that is allowed to go through. And that can only happen if all these countries together put pressure on both China and Pakistan to allow that to happen. More, in fact, on Pakistan. I don't think India by itself would be able to influence this process. And that's the main reason why the meeting of NSAs has been called by India in order to coordinate with others and to act as a group. Going forward, of course, India would like to get back in some form into Afghanistan because it has a lot of stakes there. But that is a separate question. Right now, we have two main issues which confront us, and these are the ones which will be tackled during this conference.
India has been one of the biggest contributors towards global efforts at reconstructing Afghanistan. In fact, it is the largest regional donor in Afghanistan. Why do you think Pakistan plays this perfidious role of not allowing any role? The common Afghan people want India to come and help them in building the country, in providing whatever they need. We see a lot of Afghanis coming to India for medical treatments. So they have a huge expectations from India. So what is that Pakistan has got against this? Is it like they fear that India will come and start a stronger relationship with Afghanistan and that will create a problem for them?
Yes, that is the main fear, which is, of course, quite imaginary on various counts. The fact that Pakistan does not want any Indian influence in Afghanistan is well known, and that they've been trying for a very, very long time. During the previous governments in Afghanistan, we've seen that those governments have been very close to the Indian establishment. And obviously, they did not allow their soil to be used against India, especially for terrorist purposes, for hosting of terrorist camps, which the Pakistanis want to do, and to shift the terrorist camps on Afghanistan soil in order to avoid the scrutiny of the FATF, while at the same time pursuing the policy of covert action against India. And this will only succeed if you have a pliant government in Afghanistan which actually complies with the ISI and does what they want them to do. If there's any kind of Indian influence which comes back into Afghanistan through its humanitarian aid, through its development aid, then obviously that gets negated. And this is the main reason why Pakistan is opposing, any role for India.
Let's hope that the people of Afghanistan soon can see the peace and the development which they desire, and India is able to help them in achieving that. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Wadhwa.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to a discussion on crisis in Afghanistan. The participants were Anil Wadhwa, former diplomat, and Sanjay Jha, journalist. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official.